Welcome to the Principal Podcast today. This is Xane Anderson. I have the honor of having Darryl Rodgers with us as a guest today. Darryl is a speaker, an author, a family recovery coach living in North Carolina. And as a family recovery coach, he specializes in working with parents of children struggling with substance use disorders, if I'm saying it correctly. And he also serves on the state advisory board of the North Carolina Mothers Against Drunk Driving. And I'm just really proud to have him on the show today. Darryl, thank you for being on the show with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Tell us a little bit about your story. Tell us a little bit about what your mission is now.
So just starting out with just kind of a summary, it was 2014 that my oldest son died in a wreck. It was drug related, or there was drug impairment involved in the wreck. And he had struggled with addiction for about a year and a half prior to that, had been to treatment and come back. And, just after losing him, I didn't know anything about addiction before this happened to us. And, was just really caught off guard by it. Never experienced anything like that in our family. So I didn't know anything about it, and I wanted to try to get educated on it. So I began to search, and in the process of doing that, I authored a book about my son's life and what that was like living through that. And then I made a short film that I've used some when I go into schools to speak. Is 23 minutes long. And then I got involved with MAD pretty early on, MAD, Mothers Against Drunk Driving. And so I've just been doing since about 2016 prevention speaking, and then started working with parents who have a child who's addicted to drugs or alcohol. It's kind of how I've progressed over the last few years.
Wonderful. What was your favorite thing about your son, Chase?
Good question. I would have to say his sense of humor. He was a quiet, easygoing kid, and but he had this kind of odd sense of humor, and he liked to tease people a lot, and he would say things that would really catch people off guard. And I've had some people that have reached out to me and told me, that, hey, I knew Chase. And then they started telling me some stories about some of the funny things he did and said. And I'm like, yeah, Chase, so yeah, I would say that was my favorite thing.
Thanks for sharing that. Let me ask you this, Darryl, how has the experience of losing your son changed you?
Well, it's changed me in a lot of ways. I think before all of this happened, I don't know, I guess judgmental is not the exact right word, but for lack of a better word to describe how I felt, I was a little bit, when it comes to people who had drug or alcohol addictions, I was kind of, I didn't understand. And so, yeah, I mean, for lack of a better term, I guess you'd say judgmental, that I was looking at them as being people who just weren't good people, and instead of sort of separating the choices, some of the choices, and not always necessarily the choices, but the circumstances that they found themselves in from the person. And so that's changed. I think I've mellowed out quite a bit. I'm still, I still have, I've always had a little bit of a temper, but it's usually, I'm one of these people that's very easygoing. I get along with everybody and I love people, but sometimes I could get set off, and I've gotten a lot better at keeping that under wraps, or not keeping it under wraps, but just, I don't get triggered as easily anymore. And really, in terms of our younger son, he's doing quite well. And I would say our relationship has improved a lot since the death of our older son, because I sort of was still going through some things with the younger one, even after our older son's death, in that he and I are a lot more alike. Chase was easygoing. Well, actually, in Chase and I, that part of our personality is a lot alike, but I can be stubborn, and our younger son really stubborn. And when I say that, I don't mean that in a bad way. It is actually some very good, there's some very good character traits in there. But he and I would butt heads every now and then, and that whole masculine thing, the testosterone, like you're going to show me respect, and he's coming back, well, you have to earn my respect, and anyway, kind of back and forth with some of that. And I think that I realized that particularly with him, but I think this is true with a lot of kids, that when we as parents, as they're transitioning through the teenage years into adulthood, we can back away more and let them make more of their own decisions. And it's hard to watch sometimes, because as a parent, having lived some life, they're making mistakes sometimes, and they're going to be consequences. And I learned to not give advice so much unless I was asked. And it completely flipped our relationship around to where instead of me offering advice and then it not landing well, he was reaching out to me and asking me for advice in certain situations. And so it just really, the relationship improved, and we get along great and share a lot of things together that we enjoy doing. So really good kid too.
Love that. So you said something about triggering. You said you don't get triggered as much. Tell us a little bit about that. Tell us a little bit about.
Yeah, well, I think, sometimes people will say things that, it's particularly, with all of us use social media probably way more than what we should, right? And I think, with the advent of social media, and nothing like that was around in my youth, but certainly, people say things, and even in emails, sometimes we can read things into what people say, and it's not really what they mean, or they didn't say it, and I think we can have reactions to what they say, as opposed to really thinking about it carefully and responding, because you lose a lot in the communication process when you don't have eye-to-eye contact, when you don't see facial expressions. And but just overall, something I've learned in working with parents who have a child who's struggling with an addiction or substance use disorder, whichever term you prefer. There's a lesson that we do, and I facilitate a peer support group every Monday night, and it's a volunteer thing that I do for parents that have a child that is addicted. And one of the lessons is respond, don't react, or respond versus react. And I think that can apply to a lot of relationships, not just our children, but particularly when we're working with when we're talking about a parent working with a child who is addicted, because people who are struggling with addiction tend to manipulate, and they don't mean to. A lot of times they don't really mean to do that. They're subconsciously, their mind is trying to figure out how they're going to get that next fix. And sometimes they get irritable and they'll lash out. And when someone's attacking you or they're putting pressure on you, we have a tendency to react. And if we can just take a minute and take a deep breath and pause for a second, and try to think about responding versus reacting. and you get, the reactions don't get you what you want. They don't serve you well. So,
You, you know what? I love what you're saying right here. And it reminds me of something, just briefly, if I could interject. A book that I read many years ago that it's along these same lines. There was a book called The Power of Positive Parenting. It was written by Glenn Latham. And Glenn Latham, basically, the premise of the book is this: the behaviors are kind of like seeds, and attention is kind of like water. And what happens is when somebody does something we don't like and we give them a lot of attention, it's like we're watering the seeds we don't want to have grow. So, if somebody says something I don't like and I snap back at them, what I did is I just reinforced that behavior, even though I may not have wanted to do it. And so his whole premise was, if we can start catching people doing something right, in other words, when our children are young, when our children are in their formative years, if we can say, wow, your bed, you made it, it looks great. Good job. And so the best way that they found to shape human behavior is to catch people doing something right. And when we get triggered, like you said, I love how you phrased it, by the way, it was so genius. When we get triggered, we're basically giving attention. We're if we really can say, look, I'm going to not water the weeds. So you don't get any attention if you're just saying these kind of dumb things. But as soon as you do something right, I'm going to say, hey, wow, you did a great job. You made your bed. You look at the effort you're putting into learning this math. Look at the effort you're trying to help shovel the snow or help me in the garden or whatever it is. Catching kids doing something right. They're hungry for that, instead of saying, okay, as soon as you do something wrong, you're going to get a ton of dad's attention. And then kids almost unconsciously, they think, well, I get dad's attention or mom's attention when I misbehave. And even if they can't consciously say that that's what's happening, sometimes that's what's happening. And so I like how you said, we've got to respond and not react. And one of the best things I think you can proactively respond is to start keying in and saying, what is my child doing right that I can give him attention for? And I read that book, Power of Positive Parenting, and it changed the way I thought about parenting. It changed the way I thought about relationships. And I thought, I've got to start catching some people doing something right. So I really love how you said that. Respond, don't react. I also really liked how you said, that verbal language, when we're trying to help our kids, so much is lost if you can't have a real face-to-face conversation with them. They say somebody said 93% of what you're saying is not your actual words. It's your body language. It's your tone of voice. It's how you're holding yourself. Can I maintain eye contact? And so if we can, when we're talking to people, or especially our teenagers or our young children, we can be present with them so we can see the whole gamut of what they're trying to say. That's important. So thanks for sharing that. Great point. Love that.
Thank you. Thanks. Yeah, I think, communication is so important in all of our relationships. And what I tell people is to look at it as a practice communicating better every day. And, when you practice something, you're going to have times that you're going to mess up, and forgive yourself and start practicing again the next day. It's just, communication is just so vital in everything that we do. But doctors, they call it a medical practice, right? Because you're still learning, even though you've been educated on something. We learn through our experiences as we go.
That's right. One of the things I love about just the fact that you're here is you had an experience losing your son to a drug impaired wreck. And now you're out here trying to help other parents not experience the same pain that you had. In some ways, this pain that you had, this horrible experience, is becoming right now your superpower to help others. And I really admire that. What a great thing you're doing to try to help other parents, Darryl, with situations like this.
I appreciate that. It has been healing for me. The speaking has been healing in a lot of ways. There's been a lot of spiritual and personal growth that's come out of it. and not just the speaking, but also the working with the parents. I get feedback from the parents, and I get feedback from the people I speak to, and I love people, and so all of that helps me to become a better person, make me stronger, and helps me to heal from that loss. You never get over losing a child, and maybe that's true of other relationships too. I don't want to compare grief. I think that it's all circumstantial. That for me, the grief that I experienced related to the loss of Chase was more intense than the grief of losing my parents. But my parents lived to be, my mother 87, my dad 90. I had a lot of time with them,
Awesome.
and then we could see the decline coming versus Chase being so young and just taken away. But that's not to say that someone else who loses a parent is not going to be equally as devastated as I was by losing Chase. So grief is one of those things I've learned not to say, oh, my grief is worse than yours or whatever. But for me, it's been very, very intense. And so you never get over it. And I think that I think sometimes people will say things that they don't really mean, or say things that can be hurtful to people who are in the grieving process, like, well, you just need to get over that and move on. Well, you don't get over it, but you can learn how to go on with your life and how to still be happy and productive. And I think giving back and working in an area that's related to your loss can be healing.
Yes. Let me ask you this. What advice, Darryl, would you give parents of young children to prevent them from using drugs when they're older? What would you say to parents of young children? Say, this is, having been through this nightmare, this is what I would advise.
Prevention is tough because children grow up they have a mind of their own, right? And we can't control them, but we can do things to put the odds in our favor, for a good outcome. I tell parents, that find themselves in this situation with a teenager or young adult who is addicted to drugs. Like, think of it like an arrow. Your child is an arrow, and you put the arrow on the string, you pull the bowstring back, and you pick out that target. And when I say target, it's a kind of a general target in that you want them to be well-adjusted, successful adult, and you release that bowstring and you give them all the tools to do that. When you release that arrow, they're in God's hands now. And the longer you try to hold on to that string, that bowstring, and hold on to that arrow, it creates a lot of stress. So you have to learn to let go. Not only creates a lot of stress, but you're more likely to miss the target because you're trembling now, your muscles are getting tired. So I use that a lot with those parents. But in terms of parents who are, trying to do things to be proactive and prevent that from happening, I would say, number one, spend time with your kids, doing things that they enjoy doing. I did that with both of my kids. So, but the other things I would say would be, if I had something that I could have done differently that might have made a difference, I would say, make sure that you communicate with your child in a way that they feel comfortable coming to you with problems. So I have a military background and was, I'm a very loving, compassionate person, but I also have that military side to me, so I think I definitely would say that both my boys, but particularly Chase, felt more comfortable going to my wife when he had issues. He didn't feel comfortable going to dad because dad was the authoritarian, the disciplinarian figure, So if I could have done something different, I would have tried to have communicated with him in a way that would have made him feel more comfortable with coming to me. That would be one thing. I know there's some other things. I had a thought come to me that just kind of slipped my mind, but maybe it'll come back to me in a minute. But yeah, that's definitely one of the things I would do.
Wonderful. And one of the things I think we discussed prior to the show, I heard someone say that the best outcomes with parents and children, best outcomes with children happen when parents act as if they're the CEOs of their children's education. In other words, in some situations, many people say, well, I'm just going to send my kid off to the nearest school and just hope that things go okay. But if you're a CEO of your children's education, that might mean that you can decide to use a different supplier, a different vendor, a different contractor, right? So let's just say that your children's school is having a horrible effect, and you can sense that something at that school, and maybe you can't put your finger on it, is not quite right, and your kids and things are starting to go downhill. Well, as a CEO, you don't have to say, hey, I'm going to continue putting my children in this bad environment where there's some peer pressure going on. You have a right to fire that vendor, in my view, which means I might decide to change schools. I might decide to put them in a different public school or a charter school, or maybe even a private school. Maybe I'll homeschool them. Maybe I'll do something. Maybe I need to get them involved in some sort of extracurricular activity where they can learn to do karate or play the violin or play the piano or something. But really, if parents would take that mindset that, like, I don't just have to default to what everybody else is doing, just because everybody in the neighborhood sends their kids to this school, maybe that's not the right thing for my child. Maybe I have a right to say, I'm going to homeschool you for 6 months, or we're going to take a little break and go on a family trip and learn a new culture for a while, or something. We're going to try a different school. We're going to try and taking that CEO approach, my understanding, results in better outcomes. And so I don't know if that would be something you were agreeing with. Would you say that's something that you would agree with or no?
Absolutely. I don't know why this didn't come to my mind in the beginning of that when you asked me that question, but I can remember in particular a young lady that had been friends with Chase when she got married and she and her husband had a child. She reached out to me on social media and said, if there's one thing that you would recommend to me to prevent my child from going down this path, what would it be? And the first thing out of my mouth was homeschool, because and here's what I would say, both of my boys went to public schools. One just graduated from college with a 3.7 GPA as a chemistry major, and he's been accepted in several chemistry PhD programs. He's a smart kid, and so he did fine in public schools. Here's the thing with public schools, and it's not just public schools; it could be private schools too. But your child, when they attend a school outside of the home, they're going to come in contact with other children who were not raised with the same values, or not being raised with the same values that you're raising your child with. Now, a lot of people will make the argument. They will make the argument that, well, they're going to you shouldn't shelter your children. They're going to come in contact with these things sooner or later. It gives you the opportunity to address those situations now and talk to them about it and have those conversations. Well, there's some validity to that. I would just say that I think that their brain, the brain is not fully developed until about age 25, plus or minus a couple of years. So children are very they can be influenced easily, and they can be led down the wrong path, and they need a little shielding, a little guidance, a little protection until their brain is better developed.
I agree with you 100%. They need, and I actually think you can shelter your kids. And obviously there comes a point where you have to say, I'm going to let you go into the world. I heard it described like this, if you have a little tree and it's kind of growing crooked, you could put a little string around that tree, and you could kind of stake it down in the ground and just kind of even it out. And it would just take a little kite string, nothing much, just a little string. But if you let the crooked part keep growing, eventually you might have to, I mean, if you let it go for years and years, you might have to get like a tractor or a truck and chains, and you might even have to get a chainsaw and something to try to correct the tree. And I think as our kids are young, sometimes it's just a little string, Yeah. But as they grow older, it becomes harder, because you're right. With those first years, they want to be with us all the time. And then there comes a point where we do have to let go and say, I hope that what I've taught's been enough. Right. And, And it doesn't mean we're beating up on ourselves as parents. We all make mistakes as parents. It's just saying, maybe as a parent, we take as much time learning how to be a good parent as we do to say train for our careers in the world, because one is more important than the other. And I think we know which one it is, right?
Right.
I appreciate that. That's very helpful. Spending time with your kids,
it did come
doing what they want to do. I love how you said that.
Yeah. I think that it's easy to go, oh, well, I like to do this. So I like to fish, for example. So I'm going to take my kids fishing with me, and they may grow up learning to enjoy that, and that's fine. But if say, for instance, they're like, well, that doesn't do it for me. I would rather be, I don't know, if I could think of another example. I like art. I like artwork, or I like music, or whatever it is. Then you need to adapt to them, not try to force them into what you like to do, or what, you would think you might like them to be. But I did think of one of the other points that I was going to make earlier, and that's about when you asked me about, things that you can do to help prevent your kids from going down this path of drug use, and building their confidence. Things that you can do to build their confidence, I think, is very important. Anything that you can put in place. And this is where I would caution parents: be careful about, every kid's different. And, but I would say be careful about yelling and screaming at your kid when they do things that, maybe you've had a stressful day, maybe you've had a hard day at work or whatever, and you come home and the kids are just running around and they're getting on your nerves, or whatever. Be careful about raising your voice. And I'm not saying that some kids might be fine with that, but some kids are very sensitive, and they may take it personally and internalize it in a way that is like, well, Dad must not think very highly of me, or, I'm a bad kid because Dad yelled at me because of this. You just don't know what's going on internally there. And I think if we can avoid that a little bit, it doesn't mean that you can't set boundaries that they need to have. You obviously need to do that, but you can do it in a way that is not demeaning or that doesn't make them feel bad.
Right.
Try to uplift them every chance you get. Encourage activities and things that build them up so that they have a good, so they're confident people.
I like that. Do what they want to do, kind of mold to their interests a little bit, and then build the confidence in them, and don't yell and scream. Man, what
right.
To every parent.
The thing about the confidence building is this, that a lot of times what happens with when drug experimentation starts is usually in middle school or early high school. And it's the peer pressure usually that gets them started. But if they're confident and they've been taught right from their parents, and they go into that situation, they have a much better chance of resisting the peer pressure. Right. If the peer pressure comes and their confidence level is low and they're feeling like I just don't really fit in anywhere, and I just don't feel good about myself.
Mom and dad are yelling me at home, so I don't really fit in at home, and I don't really fit in at school. They need to know they have this solid base at home that's a strength to them, rather than, gosh, I don't fit in anywhere because my dad or my mom yells at me when I get home, and now I don't fit in at school. I might as well do something to try to avoid all this and forget it.
Yeah. So when a group reaches out to them, then they feel like, well, I have a place where I belong. And, and they're, even though it's a group of people that's experimenting with drugs. And so they get started down that path. And some people, there is a genetic component here where some people are more likely to become addicted than others. But then again, it depends on the drugs that we're talking about, because there's so many drugs out there now today that are so powerful that pretty much anybody can become addicted very quickly.
But regardless of the genetic component, that I like what you said. If maybe parents who have kids beforehand, if they would just have the conversation when they were young and said, you know what, when you get older, there's a good chance people are going to ask you if you want to do these harmful substances, if you're going to want to drink, if you're going to want to smoke and do drugs and all these kind of things that we know are not good for our bodies. Let's talk about this. Do you think that you have the confidence to say no when people do this? Like, how do you think you could react? And you could walk that through and come almost role play. Like, if somebody asks you to do drugs, how are you going to react? And they can say, well, I'm going to say no. Do you think you can, even if everybody in the room's doing it? Yeah. And you can almost play the scenario out beforehand and say, you know what, this is going to happen at some point. I believe that I have confidence in you, son, or I have confidence in you, my daughter, that you're going to be strong when these situations happen. And let them know that you have faith in them before they go out into the world and experience it without mom and dad's kind of confidence that you can do this, right?
That's a really good point. And, we're working with MAD, Mothers Against Drunk Driving, has a program called Power of Youth. And one of the things that they do in that presentation is they're talking to the kids. They're talking to, we like to go in here into the driver's ed classes, how the Power of Youth program is presented. And one of the things that they address in there is underage drinking. And without going too deep into that, I just want to say that they have realized that if they, as parents, what they sort of coach the parents on is, when you have that conversation with the kids, is give them ideas for outs. In other words, if somebody comes and says, hey, just like you were talking about role playing, but they come up with an out, well, I can't today because I have this going on, or I have that going on. Or, if they have several different scenarios that they can use when that comes up, that gives them an out where they don't have to just say, no, I don't do that. And maybe they're not strong enough to do that. But if they have an out, like, well, I can't because I've got to do this, or I've got to do that, or, one great thing for along those same lines that some schools do, and in my opinion, it's a good thing. Some schools require, public schools require, if you're going to participate in any extracurricular activity, then you're subject to have a random drug test at any time. Now, there's certain school districts that do that. And here's the thing. A lot of people think, oh, that's terrible because they're invading the privacy and all of that. But part of that program is, if they discover that a kid is using, then they're going to try to find help for them. That's part of the program, is to try to intervene in that situation as opposed to punishment. And then they reach out to the parents. But here's the thing, that why that works is that football players, for instance, and I talked to a dad who did this very, very thing, or has experienced this thing. The football players are like, they were being approached at the school about, for drug use. And once they had an out, once they could say, well, I'm on the football team and, there's the random drug testing. And if I get tested, I'm off the team. I don't want to take that chance. I may have the opportunity to play in college, or I like playing football, whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
Now they have an out that makes it easy for them to say no. So anyway, I just thought I would throw that out there as a thought, and definitely the parents can work on in terms of those scenarios, coming up with different outs to make it easier for the kids to say no, because they're going to struggle somewhat, going with self-esteem, because going through puberty and going through the teenage years is tough on most kids.
Right. Well, and it comes back to that, starting as young as you can to have positive interactions, like you said, spending time with them so they know they have a safe place, avoiding yelling, so that they know mom and dad have confidence in them. And then we're catching them doing stuff right all the time, so they don't think, man, I'm just a horrible person, maybe I need to go find attention somewhere else. They feel secure with mom and dad, that they see the good in me, they love me, and they've told me, hey, I'm strong enough to say no to these guys. And maybe we've role playing out, like you said, you could say, hey, if you're having a hard time getting out of a situation, you can call me and I'll tell you that you got to come home right now. Oh no, my dad needs me to come home. It's not going to work.
That's a really good point in that, if I think back to when I was a teenager, it wasn't when I get home, I'm going to get this severe punishment if my parents find out that I've been doing this or doing that or using drugs or whatever it is. It was the fear of disappointing them, because I knew how much they loved me and I knew that they wanted me to succeed, and I knew how much they were pouring into my life. I didn't want to let them down. I didn't want to disappoint them. So, when people, I was tempted sometimes to try some things when I was going through that stage of life. And I would, in the back of my mind, it was going around, man, this is really going to devastate mom and dad if they find out I'm doing this or I did that, So that was the thing for me. It wasn't the fear of punishment. It was the fear of letting down my parents.
Right. So letting them know, yeah, interesting. Letting your kids know
all kind of ways that you can all kind of ways that you can let them know how much you love them, through your actions. Some people need to hear it. And I know, my generation, guys just don't, obviously, or really my parents' generation was even more so that way, that people just didn't say, I love you that much. They weren't as open about it. But I think it's very important that people need to hear, especially our children. We need to tell them that we love them, and then we need to show them that we love them. And it could be a hug, and then spending time with them.
Let's go play a board game, or let's go play chess, or let's go throw the ball, or let's go do something together that you want to do. Let's go hike a mountain. Yeah.
Yeah. The five love languages. The five love languages is a great book. Have you heard, you know which one I'm talking? Yeah, it's a really good book. I know which one
you're talking about. Yeah, that's a great book. Yeah. Showing the love in the way that's meaningful to them.
That's right. Yeah.
That's wonderful. So you brought something up here that I wanted to talk about, and I can shift gears here. So, Stephen Covey wrote this book about the 7 habits of highly effective people. And he basically said, when we focus on things that are not urgent, so not urgent, but important, we have less crises later on, which are urgent and important. So, an urgent and important thing is something like, somebody gets hit by a car, they immediately need to get to the doctor and get surgery or get a bandage or something. That's a crisis. That's urgent and important. And we all want to not have to get to these crises. But the key to that is working on things when they're not urgent, but they're still important. So you're saying it's, my kid's 6 years old. He's not off hanging out with the wrong kids at 6 years old. He's not doing anything at 8 years old. Those are the times where I can have those meaningful conversations and say, hey, you know what? Right. When you get older, you're going to have somebody ask you if you want to do drugs. These are why we don't do drugs. Can you, and do you see why it's so important to not do that? And so if I can have those conversations when they're 6 and 7 and 8 and 9 and 10, before we get into the 13, 14, 15, where as you say, you kind of lose control. You kind of have more control when they're young. And as they get older, it's kind of like letting that arrow go, where it's like, well, I hope they're flying the right direction. Right. But so there's two kind of things I wanted to ask you about. We've talked about prevention, which is building that relationship, spending time with them, catching them doing something right, listening to them, being kind and gentle rather than forceful and demanding and yelling. Let me ask you this. Let's say that for some reason, a parent is suspecting that their child is using drugs. They're not certain. So it's now kind of a crisis. What advice would you give to parents who may be suspecting that their child is using drugs, but isn't certain?
Step one, go back to respond versus react.
There you go.
Because the very first thing that happens with almost every parent is they freak out. They have a reaction to that, and they start, just really lighting in on their child and giving them a hard time and asking them questions. And so I think, to just calm yourself down a little bit before you go into the conversation. Here's the thing that oftentimes they will lie to you, particularly if they're using drugs. Chase, growing up, he would not tell a lie. I don't care what happened. If he thought he was in trouble about something, he would still tell the truth about it. And in about the middle of the 10th grade, I caught him in a couple of lies, and it just seemed like it went downhill from there. That's something that goes along with drug abuse. It changes the way your brain works, and there's some shame and some guilt there, and they just can't deal with it. And so you can't go necessarily on what they tell you. In fact, I would tell you can't go on that. And if they're still living in your house and they're a teenager, then you get to set the rules. You're the parent. And it's a dictatorship. It's a benevolent dictatorship, and you're looking out for their best interest, but you're in charge. And so and that dynamic changes once they turn 18. But until that point, I would say, if you have to drug test, then drug test. But you need to get the answers. Do you need to know? Can you go into their room? Absolutely. You can go into their room and search their room and do whatever you need to do to verify. Now, I don't like the idea of spying, snooping, looking in on them without their consent, without knowledge. Their knowledge that that's going on, to try to sneak around and get information. What I would rather parents would do would be, first of all, because of this society that we live in today with social media and phones and the internet and all of that, and information just being so readily available, is before your child reaches that age, as they're coming of age and they're going to get access to some of those things, and you're thinking about giving them. And I would say this with video games too, because video games can be very addictive. I would say that you need a written contract in advance that says, these are the conditions. I'm providing the video game. I'm providing the phone. I'm buying it. I'm paying for it. I'm paying for the service. So here's the contract. You get to use it, but only if but here are the terms of the contract. Now read this and sign it. And we'll go through it and read it out loud and sign it at the bottom. And this says that if you break the agreement, if you breach the contract, then you lose the privilege of using that phone or whatever. And part of that, yeah, it's a privilege. Absolutely. And part of that could be, look, I have the right at any time to go in and look at your messages. I'd rather not have to do that, but I don't want to do that. But if I suspect that you're using drugs, I may go take a look and see who you're talking to and what you're talking about. If they know that in advance, that's different than sneaking around and looking at what they're doing. So you set these terms up you set that up in advance. And,
right.
I was coming into all of that was developing as my kids were growing up. So particularly Chase, Chase was born in 93. The internet and social media wasn't nearly where it is today back then.
Mm-hmm.
So, some of those things I didn't think about, or it didn't come to my mind until a little bit later. And anyway, definitely. If once it happens, once you suspect that it's going on, you have to find ways to get the answers of, is your suspicion just probably correct? If you suspect they're using drugs,
trust your parental instinct.
Absolutely, because usually if you think that it's going on, it's probably been going on for a little while and is probably worse than what you think it is. I'm just going to tell you, that's just the way it is in most of these situations. And they'll deny it. So you've got to get to the bottom of it, get the truth, and then you can decide what the next steps are in terms of taking the appropriate action. But you do need to know the truth.
I like that. And as a parent, you have a right to set boundaries out of love.
Absolutely,
and it's not because, if I tell my child, you can't run out in front of the street, in front of that truck, my child might hate me.
Right.
But I'm not telling him that because I'm trying to restrict him. It's because I love him and I'm trying to protect him. I like what you said too. We don't give our kids, let's use a car analogy again. I don't just say to my 10-year-old, hey, here's the keys to my car, go drive. Mm-hmm. If my kid's going to learn to drive, he's got to wait till he's the appropriate age. He's got to take driver's ed. He's got to have some time with dad driving around with a learner's permit or whatever that's, whatever it is in that particular jurisdiction. And at some point after he's shown that he's trustworthy and he has some skill and he has some experience, then you give him a license and say, now you can drive. And the same thing, why would you just give your kid a cell phone, which has access to anything? I mean, we're talking all kinds. I mean, there's some great things you can do with a cell phone. Don't get me wrong. I'm not anti-technology. I love technology, but the fact that I would just hand a kid a phone and say, hey, good luck, is you wouldn't hand your kids a 10-year-old keys to the car. And I think it's okay to say, we're going to have some guardrails. And at some point you are going to have a phone that I'm not going to be able to check. When you're an adult, you're going to have a check, maybe even before then. But while we're learning to give you this very powerful device, we're going to have a few guardrails. And some of that is going to be that we're going to check in and see what's going on the phone from time to time. And it's not because we hate you. It's because we love you. You may feel restricted. It's not a fence. It's a guardrail that keeps you from going off a cliff. And I think that's important for parents to know. I really, when kids are down to the point where they've had some of these things, the real key, in my opinion, is to build, like you were saying, spend time with them when they're young, catch them doing something right, be the CEO. If you can tell things are going crazy or they're going a little wonky, going the wrong direction, change directions. You can change it early before it gets to be a crisis, right? The best time to work on things is not when things are blowing up. The best time to work on things is when they're calm and they're good. They even say if you're in a fight, let me give you an example. Like if you're arguing with your spouse or with your teenager, almost all the time that doesn't happen. But if you can get yourself down to the same level as you would be when you're in a boardroom and you're just coming up with ideas about how to solve a problem at work or how to solve a problem, that boardroom type calm, let's talk it out, let's think it out, let's reason. That's when you're in that low, non-stressed out, anxious way. That's the time to talk to your kids about why we shouldn't do drugs, why we shouldn't do certain things, why I'm going to check your cell phone, why we might be switching schools if we need to, or whatever it is, right? Not waiting till it's a blow up and then trying to yell at each other and scream and get through it. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. And that kind of goes back to what I said earlier in that, every kid's different, and Chase was very quiet and shy. And so I didn't know what was going on, but I knew something was not right. And I didn't know what else to do. I knew he was ADD, ADHD diagnosed, and not the most severe case, very much lower on the spectrum. But I felt like that for him at that point, moving, he was starting to fail one of his classes, and his grades were just dropping. He was developing a really rebellious attitude. And at that point, I moved him to a we talked about it. Okay. And he would tell you that I forced him to move to transfer to that. I transferred him to a military school. The way I saw it was, if he had said, no, that's not what I want to do, I really don't want to do that, I would have said, fine, we'll stay where you are, or we'll find another alternative. But at any rate, we ended up moving him to get him into a different environment, because I felt like that the discipline and structured environment would be good for him. And it was. There were some things going on at that particular time at that school that turned out not to be the greatest situation for him to be in. And I didn't see that, going into it, but he got his grades up and he graduated. But anyway, I guess my point here is that I didn't see the problems coming until, boom, they were on me. And I think that's because of him being so quiet. So that's where you really have to be proactive, particularly if you have a kid that is quiet and will not talk to you about things. And you have to really have your antenna up as a parent. And if you think there's something's not right, then you're probably right. And it's probably worse than you think. And I hate to say that in a way, because, the kids are probably like, oh my gosh, now, my parents are going to suspect if I did one thing wrong that is 10 times worse. But you almost have to be that way as a parent, in that particular phase of parenting, in my opinion, because there's so much out there that can go wrong so fast.
That's great. Is there anything else you would tell parents right now? Parents at all, advice that you would give parents, Darryl?
Don't let a day go by without telling your kids how much you love them and showing them how much you love them, because they could be gone. They could be gone in the blink of an eye. And I hope that no one that's listening to this ever has to experience that, because that's just devastating for everybody, for the whole family, for the friends, for everybody. We have a lot of great memories that we built with Chase, and that's one of the things that keeps us going. And we did tell him that we loved him, and he knew that. Unfortunately, that arrow is going to leave the bowstring sooner or later, one way or another. And that arrow, sometimes there are gusts of wind that will kick it off and knock it off course, or it'll hit a low-hanging branch or whatever, and it gets thrown off course, or it's an arrow that has a mind of its own. So all you can do is give them the best nurturing environment that you possibly can. And you're going to make some mistakes, but and when you do that, you're going to have to forgive yourself, and you're going to have to become aware of your mistakes and be willing to correct them and get better as a parent moving forward. But man, just love your kid, love on your kids, and build those memories.
I love that you said that, Darryl. And I think that if your kids know you truly love them, in some ways that can, you can let your kids know, I'm not perfect, I make mistakes, but I want you to know I love you with all my heart, and be brave enough to tell them that all the time. I love that. I heard my grandma actually used to say, she said, no matter the question, love is the answer. And I think you just embodied that same kind of feeling, like, if I can just let my kids know I love them, even if they're doing stupid things.
Right. Unconditional love. Yeah.
Unconditional love in the long run doesn't fail. And I appreciate you sharing that, Darryl. Thank you so much for being on the show. How can people reach out to you, get a hold of you if they want to reach out to you, get from your wisdom, learn from you, your wisdom?
Thank you. TheFamilyRecoveryCoach.com. TheFamilyRecoveryCoach.com is my website. You can go to Facebook and type in parenting addicted children. I have a Facebook group that people can come join if they like. I'm on, I have a TikTok channel. I have a TikTok. I haven't made any videos lately, but there's a lot of good videos on there about dealing with a child who's addicted. And so anyway, those are the three things that come to my mind right off the bat. Awesome. Reach out through one of those channels if there's anything that I can do to help you. Because I know how stressful it is for parents that are going through this. It's really tough. So, yeah.
Wow, such good advice. Thank you for sharing your wisdom with us, Darryl. This is Darryl Rodgers, spelled Darryl Rodgers, Rodgers, correct? Is that right, Darryl?
Yeah.
Such an honor to have you on the show, out making a difference in the world, trying to help people with the problem that's very prevalent today. So, thank you so much again, Darryl, for being on the show.
Thank you, Xane. Thanks for having me on.
I am so jealous of my wife because she gets the ultimate career. She gets to train and nurture and love our children more than I get to, because I have to be doing things like this podcast. Parenting is the ultimate career. If you like what you heard today, please like, subscribe, comment, leave a review. Thank you for listening. You can also check out my book, What I Want My Children to Know Before I Die. It's available on Amazon and other bookstores. Thanks again for listening.